everyone. It's great to see a few familiar faces. And really, what we wanted to do with this is try and make it as similar to the real interviews that you hopefully have all got coming up fairly soon. We're going to go through each of the main bits: portfolio, prioritization, clinical scenarios. And really, I've got to say a big thank you to the Fun Ortho team. So that's Anu, Rash, Sharmali, Karen, and Frank. All really worked hard to put stuff together. We've got great faculty, we've got TPDs, we've got trainers of the year, we've got people who are really passionate about education. So make the most of us, ask us questions, don't be afraid to say silly things. Way better to say stuff now than in your actual interview. And don't just ask us, use us, right? So today's faculty, me, I think hopefully you all know me, I'm a consultant at Barts Health, along with Mr. Aresti, who is waving at the moment as well, and we've got Mr. Sirat Khan, who's a consultant at the Royal Free NHS Trust. We happen to be best mates, and actually between us I think we all ranked top 5 as I remember, so hopefully legitimate to give you a bit of advice. We've got Mr. Vamulapalli, who is somewhere on the screen, he's won trainer of the year in our region so many times I've lost count, and he's on the BOFAS education committee. So Mr. V, thanks very much. And last but not least, Mr. Achan, consultant colleague of mine at Barts Health, long-standing TPD of the pot rotation, probably the best TPD in the country. I said probably just in case anyone sues, and one of a lot of our mentors. So we've also got a great stellar lineup of regs and stuff. Sorry, I didn't want to waste too much time into introducing everyone. You'll meet everyone as we go along. But thanks to all of the faculty for giving up your time. Really appreciate it. I'm sure that everyone does. So I'm going to hand across now. Enough of me. Mr. Achan.
Can you hear me, guys?
Yeah.
Well, firstly, a massive thank you, one, for inviting me, but also to the whole Fundamentals of Orthopaedics team, but also Lucky for putting this all together, because I think it's an incredible help for you guys to have this as a resource as you come into that run-up to interviews. So what is the portfolio station all about? And for me, I think, having been a TPD for over 10 years now, it really is the opportunity for you guys to showcase what it is that you've done to date. And I know the interview has gained more and more structure so that when you're self-evaluating or we're scoring based on your portfolio, it's very clear what you have to achieve in your clinical domain, in your logbook domain, in your research bit, in your audit bit. But when you put that all together, that is your portfolio. That is a summation of not only how good you are, but how much better you are than your peers. And certainly it was really striking for me in the early days when we were doing face-to-face interviews, either regionally or now nationally, when somebody would come in with a portfolio that was perfectly bound with a really neat name on top and everything was well organized. And somebody else would turn up with a Tesco bag and a bunch of papers together. And just on the surface of that, you can't tell who's got the more accomplished achievement to date, but there was no doubt in anyone's mind who was more organized and who had a portfolio that was more representative of achievement and ability and ambition between those two scenarios. And so what we're really going to try and pull out of you today is give you an opportunity, and these you'll see are very open-ended questions, but we're going to give you an opportunity really to shine. And that's what you have to recognize, is that everyone who's interviewing you, when they ask you a question saying something like, tell me about your research background, or tell me about what you've done clinically to date, tell me why you want to do orthopedics, there is no catch there. It genuinely is an opportunity for you to shine and show how much ambition you have, but also what your track record to date is. Because for me, at least, there's a very strong correlation between people who've achieved stuff at the point of interview to people who are then successful as trainees. And eventually our aim is to turn you out as brilliant orthopedic consultants. It's not just about ranking for this and then that being the end of the road. So I wish you all the best. As Lucky said, use all of us. You know, I look around the faculty, right the way through from trainees to fellows to consultants and newly appointed consultants, as well as some older folk like myself and Mr. Vemalapalli. You've got a huge resource here. Make the most of it. If you are feeling nervous before this, then you have to, because that's probably a real representation of what you've got coming ahead of you. I'll hand you over to the crew. Enjoy it. But if you are feeling nervous, like I said, that's going to be a representation of the real thing. So it's good practice.
The next bit of the session will be getting some advice from current ST3s who've gone through the interview process from last year. Some great candidates here as well. So first we'll start off with Ajay Asokan, who's an ST3 on the Royal London rotation, with his top tips for this year's interview.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us this evening. So I'll keep it as brief as I can. So obviously we're doing portfolios, and that's got to be my first tip, which is definitely don't neglect your portfolio station. Everyone's going to be quite comfortable with clinical to a reasonable degree by the time we get around to interviews. But it might be 2-3 years since someone's asked you what's your biggest strength, or when was the last time you were involved in a datix. Give me an example of team working, either in work or outside of work. Unless you've got some slightly left field friends, you're probably not going to be chatting about that on a on a week-to-week basis. So you've got plenty of time from now until interviews. Try and make some jot down some real examples of those scenarios, in datix, when something gone wrong operatively or right, etc., etc. The second tip is, my feeling from the interview last year was that it really benefited people who have just been around and dealt with people either in fracture clinics or dealt with complications after operations, etc. For example, the scenario I got in my clinical station was a carpal tunnel. It was a pregnant lady who had typical symptoms, and it was dealing with them from taking a history all the way to how you do the operation, and then a bit of rehab afterwards. I'm fortunate that in my CT I've just done a few of those, so I kind of dealt with it, if you like. But if you're someone who has obviously been unstuck by COVID or whatever it might be, you may not have gone around to sort of bread and butter things. So again, plenty of time. If you're not on an orthopaedic job, or even if you are, don't spend your time all the time in theatres. Go down to fracture clinics. You really can learn a lot in those scenarios. And then the last tip is, again, I mean, this goes for any interview, but certainly with the virtual format, it's all about communication. You got to make sure all your answers are structured, efficient, and just delivered in a professional manner. One of the ways I kind of practiced that last year was we had a WhatsApp group with 2 or 3 friends. We send an X-ray or a case, and then we'd all reply with voice messages. So someone might present the X-ray, someone might send a voice message with the immediate management, then the operative management, etc., etc. I definitely recommend doing that. Obviously it's easy to do on an on-call or whatever it might be, and also you've got a recording there to listen back to a later date, etc. So that's just a few tips from me. I'll hand over to, I think Saima's next.
Yeah, I'm next. So my 3 top tips would be, number 1, as much as Ajay said, don't forget about portfolio, and this is a portfolio station. My next thing would be, don't forget about prioritization. Prioritization is such an important station. And actually, I think if you were to retrospectively look at the disparity in scores between people that scored, really in that top 10, top 20, and people that were down at 100, the main disparity in score would be in people that were in prioritization. And the main thing to think about prioritization is it's not just about answering the question. So, you can sit there and give them, a list order, and that's great. But what's really important is that you sit there and tell them your knowledge, tell them what you know about that fracture, tell them what you know about the management of that fracture, and then apply it. Show that extra level of thinking that you've thought about that fracture in the context of that patient, and then what that means in terms of what you can do for them operatively and what priority they should be. So really treat it as a knowledge station. It's really a surrogate clinical station, because it's really where you show that, oh, I just haven't read a book. I've looked at that book, interpreted the content of that book in the context of my own practice, and then using my clinical judgment, which I think is reasoned, this is what I think we should do. And I think that is a real distinguisher between candidates, and it's something you should always, always, always think about. And I really do think that is a distinguishing station, as well as portfolio. So, you know, everyone's going to do well in clinical. We've all done orthopedics. We've all done orthopedic SHO. We've run an on-call. We've presented in a trauma meeting. We know how it works, right? So everyone's going to do really, really well. But do people really know how to say, oh, this is what my order would be in terms of priority? And then if someone challenges you, are you able to justify that? And I think the ability to do that, applying the knowledge that you know and applying it in the context of a patient, is a real signature of a distinguishing, like a candidate that's going to be top scoring. So that would be my advice. It's something that I use, and I think it worked well. My next tip would be to become very accustomed to teams. So if you can find a revision group, and if you can find revision sessions that you can do them on Teams. It will really help you. You know, you need to make sure that when you do the interview, it's not the first time you use Teams. Everything needs to be familiar, so that you go into kind of autopilot and the nerves don't get you, and you don't get too kind of worked up about the kind of intricacies of using Teams. It's not necessarily the most user-friendly thing I've ever seen. So make sure you use Teams early and you become accustomed to it. The last tip that I would give you is make sure that, you know, there are loads of regs out there and they're really supportive, but what's really important is find someone that is willing to challenge you. Find someone that is willing to take an answer you give and say, well, why did you do that? What is your, you know, what if this happened? What if this happened? You need to make sure that every single answer you give, you can justify, because that really shows that higher level of thinking, you know, that you're ready to be a reg, because you're asking people, why have they done that? So find someone that makes you feel uncomfortable, that kind of makes you sweat, and then that kind of gives you a mock interview with it. Oh my goodness, that didn't go well. So when it happens in the interview, that isn't the first time that's happened. You need to get really accustomed to that feeling of feeling nervous, of feeling uneasy, and of feeling put under pressure, because then you'll be able to really flourish if you then can control your nerves and really bring out the best thing in your performance. I'll hand over to Dan, who's going to give our last few pointers.
All right, evening all. So again, I've got 3 points. My first one's a slightly boring one, but it's just think about the technical factors of this being a virtual interview. And what I mean by that is you want to have backup plans in place. So if for some reason your Wi-Fi goes down, what are you going to do? If that means you need an Ethernet cable, if that means you need your mobile ready to hotspot, you want to back up for that. It's unlikely to happen, but if it does, then you're pretty stuck. Second thing along those lines, think about actually getting some, not fancy headphones necessarily, but anything that has a built-in microphone will actually make a really big difference. You may not have got an email yet, but you'll probably get one before the interview that actually says that the panel recommend that you have headphones, just because it improves the quality of what you can hear, but also it makes it a bit easier for the interviewer to be able to hear you as well. So you don't need a boom mic, but just something that slightly improves the quality of the sound can make a really big difference. Similarly, think about the position of your laptop. Think about what's going to be behind you. No one wants the up the nostrils view that you can get if the camera's in the wrong place. So just think about what your physical setup is going to be, so that you come across as well as possible before you even actually start speaking. And lastly, on that point, before they start the interviews, often they will get you just to show the rest of the room. So they will literally get you to spin your camera or your laptop around. And I think that's meant to be to check that you don't have a load of notes pinned up or someone else in the background feeding you answers. But if you turn the camera around and you've got a pile of dirty washing and 5 boxes of empty pizza, that's not going to look great. So just think about your general setup. Second point, in a way, kind of following on from what Saima says, and I think it's you do really want to show off your knowledge. And one relatively simple way I tried to do this was that I would pull in the kind of buzz phrases that relate to the answer as soon as possible. So they put up an X-ray, they ask you just to describe it. Let's say it's a proximal humerus fracture. You can say, this is a proximal humerus fracture. As per NIRS classification, it's a 3-part proximal humerus fracture. And then you can carry on giving your answer, but it just feeds into the interviewer's mind that you know what you're talking about. You're talking about the management of a hip fracture. You say, this is a whatever fracture, this is how we're going to manage it as per the NHS guidelines in order to meet the BPT criteria. You're just feeding in all the things that you know about. The caveat with those is that you have to know the thing that you're feeding, because if you say BPT criteria and then they ask you the criteria and you don't know them, that's obviously going to make you look a bit daft. So try and kind of fill out your answers as well as you can. Last thing, and this one's more specific to portfolio itself, think about what the scoring domains actually are for that interview. So portfolio is 50 marks. Of the 50, 20 of the marks are actually pretty much just for your communication skills. It's how well you get your answers across, and it's whether you can structure your answer in a nice, concise and logical way. 30 marks are actually for the content of what you're saying, and they broadly break down into career motivation, academia in general, and teamwork and leadership. And so if for each of those 3 criteria, you can think up of a few good examples. So if they throw at you, tell me what's the best thing you've done in an academic context, you've got an answer that's ready to go. And it just means that when they put you on the spot, even if it's a slightly unusual question, you might have an answer that you can borrow a chunk from whilst you're thinking about what you're going to say next there.
Cool, awesome. Thanks, Dan, Simon, Ajay there. Some great tips there. And as they've all said, get some advice from current registrars, people who've done the interview recently, and they can tell you what they found helpful and what their own individual tips and tricks are on the way. We're running a little bit ahead of time, so that gives you guys a little bit more of a chance to have some Viva practice, which is good. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we move on to the Viva sessions. If those who have been assigned to be Vivaed, if you could please put a bracket with Viva just at the end of your name, that would be really helpful for the faculty to know who to actually ask the questions to. And if you are being questioned, please put your video on, because the interview will require you to put your video on, so don't be too shy about things. And those who aren't being Vivaed, please turn your videos off and turn your microphones off as well. It's a standard Zoom etiquette, really. If there's no questions from anyone on the floor right now, I think we can start moving to breakout rooms.
Rash, just give us a few seconds.
Sure. If anyone has any questions at any point, do feel free to post them in the chat, and I can either reply to you individually or we can put them on here as well.
Can I just mention one more point that Saima, Dan and I were talking about? I don't think they will have your portfolio there. I know that was a bit of a question, or certainly I had last year, which is obviously different to preceding years. In preceding years, you know, obviously they look through your portfolio for 15 minutes before you rock up. So, you know, they've got it there in front of them to ask you about. But I really don't think, and certainly they didn't last year, have your actual, whatever you submit as a self-assessment, to ask you about specifically. So they won't say, tell me about this audit you've done in F2. They will just say, tell me about an audit that you've done, or, you know, whichever one you're most proud of, etc. That may or may not be useful to know. But.
Just to add that for those of you that are scrambling around to work out how to change your name on Zoom, there's 3 dots in the top right hand corner of your picture. If you click that and scroll down to the bottom, there's a rename function. You can call yourself whatever you like, brackets Viva.
Just had a couple of people ask me as well how they sign up to Viva Practice. In the initial email that we sent out with signups, you'd have requested whether you were happy to be Vivaed or not for a particular session. If you're not sure, do feel free to just use that link again, and we can filter through, or you can message me individually for each session and say that you're happy to be Vivaed, or if you change your mind last minute and you don't want to be, then feel free to message me about that as well. And just another question in the chat from Kareem: are there any sources that would help to understand more about prioritization? So as Saima quite rightly pointed out, the prioritization is sort of an extension of the clinical station. So you've got to understand all your BOAST guidelines, all your BPT guidelines, that kind of thing, and then understand your basic theatre ordering rules, things like dirty cases last, kids and diabetic patients towards the beginning if possible. open fractures, emergencies, things like that early on as well. That's the main thing. There's lots of other resources as well. You can find online past scenario questions. Have a look at those. Those will give you a good idea.
What I would also add to that is the best resource that you have about prioritization, and certainly the best one that I use, are the registrars that work around you. They are the ones that do it day in, day out. So what you need to do is, when you're on call, when you're on a night shift, you know, or if you're at the end of an on-call, you need to say to your registrar, well, this is what I would prioritize a list in, and this is why I would do it. And then they need to give you feedback. I think for me, for prioritization, the two things that helped me was, firstly, the knowledge that it's applied clinical. So you have to show your clinical knowledge. So it's mainly a knowledge station, and then apply it. But then secondly was actually going through prioritization stations with my registrars. They were the biggest help that I had. So I would use, you know, you have such a wealth of experience and knowledge around you. Literally, you work with them every day. So use them, let them help you, and they will be the biggest help. You'll be so grateful to them.
Can I just add something there? Kareem, that's a great question. If you actually put yourself in the other seat or across the table and think of the people who are setting this question up and what they're trying to understand, it's really about your acknowledgement of knowledge. And so almost in your mind, you can think, and Raashad's been through this, but they're going to have a child there. They're going to have a diabetic or an elderly patient there. They're going to have an open fracture. And the key point already you can see is that there isn't necessarily a right answer for the prioritization. It's really about you verbalizing your understanding and also relating it to your scenario. So you could probably say, well, in my hospital, we have a fractured neck of femur theater that allocates those patients straight. So I would be looking to get this patient in there and set them up and tee them up with the anesthetic team the night before so that they're optimized for surgery. We have a separate pediatric trauma list where I'd be looking to try and sneak this kid in. And the point being, there isn't a right or wrong answer. It's really, as Simon says, an opportunity for you to verbalize your depth of knowledge, not only of why you would prioritize in a certain way, but actually what are the drivers for the prioritization and how you're thinking out loud. And what needs to come across is order, organization, knowledge, but also safety, that you're aware of all these patients and that you're not just bumping someone off, because classically there'll be a fractured neck of femur that's been cancelled twice before, right? Somebody's asked if you're allowed to make notes during the prioritization station. You can do, as they're giving you the scenarios, you can write down and make notes, and you can keep referring to them. But if you become this person who's just looking down there and not looking at the camera through it, you lose the impact of the Viva opportunity. So again, like everyone has said, practicing is a great thing, but practicing on Zoom as well as practicing with your registrars, you know, write up a question yourself, you know, make those 5 cases yourself, and then say to a registrar, okay, this is how I'm going to list this. This is our trauma list for tomorrow. This is how I'm going to do it. What do you think? You know, easy to do.
Just to add to that, Mr. Achan, about making notes. So logistically, they will flash up a PowerPoint that's got the whatever 4 or 5 patients on there. And so, you know, you don't really need to make any notes, and probably what's better is just talk out loud. So just talk out what you're actually thinking. And then
yeah, fair point. So
in what Simon said about showing your knowledge.
Good stuff. So we're ready to move out to the breakout rooms. So you will gradually be assigned to your own breakout rooms. If we could also ask the faculty to just put the either faculty or interviewer or something like that after their names, just to help differentiate as well.